So today I want to talk about a story from West Point High School in Mississippi, where two black students who earned the honors of Valedictorian and Salutatorian were forced to share their place with white students. This story has a lot of components to it that I want to cover, with issues from grading to racism and history to classism. But before I delve into all of that, I want to take a look at an article to explain some of the background details to all this before I break things down. So we have an article here from the New York Times. Two black students won school honors. Then came the calls for a recount. After two white families claimed a grade calculation error, a Mississippi school added their children as co-valedictorian and co-salutatorian, reviving questions about race and equity. So as we are aware, these two black students won the position of valedictorian and salutatorian. But almost immediately, the parents of other students near the top rankings raised questions about who should have been honored. Within days and breaking with long-standing tradition, the high school decided to name two valedictorians and two salutatorians, with the two white students joining the two black students who had already been named. The families who were upset about this situation blamed a mistake made by a school counselor that resulted largely from a confusion over which of two methods to calculate grades that should have been used. Now, given that this is in Mississippi, the New York Times goes on to state quite accurately, in Mississippi, where some public schools once defied federal orders to admit black students and issues of educational equity are still raw, who gets honored and how can dredge up painful questions that are impossible to disentangle from the state's racial history. And that's very true and something we will definitely go over the course of this video. Every year around graduation, the lawyer Lisa Ross in Jackson, the state capital, said, "Every year around graduation, I get calls from parents who are concerned that their children are being cheated out of valedictorian and salutatorian. Race is still really a big struggle in Mississippi." So this is something that is not unique, and it certainly happens more than just in this case. As we go through, the issue between the two different formats of grading was either GPA, which is just basically an average of all of your grades, or a QPA, which takes into account the quality or the difficulty of certain courses when you calculate grades. So that if you have, say, a harder course like an AP or an honors course, that would get weighted against the other courses which are not considered to be honors or in some ways higher or more difficult course. And furthermore, to make matters worse, one of these students was actually allowed to record a grade in the system past the deadline from when they were supposed to be able to do so. And that same person is a descendant of the co-founder of Bryan Foods, one of West Point's largest employers. Even though the local Bryan pork processing factory shut down in 2007, the family remains one of the town's most influential. Several local institutions bear the name of the family, including the public library. And to make all of this worse, the family of the two black students were not informed beforehand, and that all of this basically reeks of a lot of racism. And the family, the white family involved, has actually been called racist and claims this has nothing to do with race, and it's just been made racial, and that infuriates me. This has to do with math. And so there's that claim that none of this actually has to do with race. So I want to break a bunch of this down. And I want to start with grading as a whole. Why is grading a competition in the first place? And I think that's a question that does not get asked enough. When we look at this type of situation and we have students literally competing for the position of valedictorian and salutatorian and all of these honors, we need to question what it is that's going on in these circumstances. Well, in reality, what's going on is that children are literally being forced to compete with each other for these averages and the GPAs because they are all competing for scholarships. A lot of scholarships are based on your GPA or QPA, and a lot of them are given specifically to valedictorians and salutatorians. So a lot of these students are in competition because they know that if they get the grades that they do and they, compete against each other, then they'll be able to have an easier time getting into college, which means they'll have an easier time getting into a career. And these decisions that we make for kids as teenagers can actually influence the rest of their lives and their outcomes. And to me, that's kind of sick to have kids compete in that way. And it actually creates some really odd incentives for children. For example, it invites competitiveness instead of cooperation for study groups. It forces kids into literally going into study sessions and potentially sabotaging each other, potentially working against each other, wanting to study alone as opposed to in a group, which is often one of the best ways to learn. And it definitely fosters an attitude where certain people with certain statuses financially have certain advantages over other students. And especially because they can afford tutors, they can afford any other, resource to bring in, like extra textbooks to help give that competitive advantage. And essentially, it takes money to make money in this case. If you want that scholarship, you have to compete. And if you want to compete, you have to pay in. And if you want to do all of that, you also have to start competing with each other for studying, as well as gaming the system of high school. Which, as absurd as that might sound to some people, happens a lot more often than people would like to admit. Children will pick classes which benefit them the most. If you're in a school that uses GPA over QPA, meaning that no matter what class you take, it's graded equally, you'll see students start to take classes that are considered easy A's in order to generate a 4.0 or close to a 4.0 average. If you have a school that has a QPA creating the grading system to determine valedictorian and salutatorian, you'll end up getting students trying to take the most advanced class possible and competing in those classes to try to outperform each other in order to secure that position. And again, all of this is done because the outcomes that come out in high school end up determining long-term factors of life, including where you go to college, what kind of scholarships you get, and that can determine whether or not you have an advantage in making it into a career or not. And that's actually a really scary proposition that we're forcing kids to fight against each other at such an early age. That said, there is a better alternative. We could just give an honors to the, say, top 10% of students, or we could eliminate grades entirely and try to focus it on education-based systems. Especially because as students pick classes based on whether or not ones are honors or not, there are going to be career paths and education that they either get or miss out on that's influenced by gaming the system. So it would be much better if they were able to, share honors in some way, shape, or form. That said, in this particular case, in this particular system, what we're dealing with is a case where the current reality of GPAs and QPAs and all of the competition is already in play. So given that, I believe more than anything, if we're going to try to base this off of merit, QPAs do actually make more sense than GPAs. If we're talking again about a merit-based system, regardless of how fair it is because of the fact that tutors can be bought and all these other factors that we can consider with economic factors and social factors, QPA just makes far more sense to address what would be put into a valedictorian or a salutatorian. Those who take much harder classes and still excel in them should, by all accounts, be given a higher reward than people who are in classes that are not considered as advanced. And so given our current system, I do acknowledge that the QPA is a better system. And in this particular case, since competition again was the main focus of all of this, we really need to address the racism angle in all of it, at how the school really messed up how this competition ended up. So, first off, let's go into the history. This occurs in Mississippi. This is in West Point, Mississippi. The racial tension in schools in Mississippi is hardly new. Despite Brown versus Board of Education being in 1954, Mississippi has ignored federal orders and didn't start the desegregation process until the early 1970s. And even then, they have continued to fight back against this to the point that many areas are still dealing with issues of segregation or segregation within classrooms or school buildings themselves. As a matter of fact, an article in 2019 points out 63 years after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, segregated classrooms still persist. And again, this is in 2019, where we have that more than 6 decades after the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. Some of the school districts are segregating classrooms, some have all black classes, and some majority white classes. And they will do that and set it up so that there's maybe 1 or 2 black students in a classroom while otherwise segregating it in order to claim that they are not being, against the law and they are properly desegregated. And so they're finding any loophole possible. And that's been occurring for decades now. These kind of half attempts at desegregation. Now, when it comes to all of this as well, we need to ask a question. If the parents of the 2 white children had seen their children lose to 2 white children, would they have reacted quite the same way, given all of that racial tension and history? This really does feel like another case where a white family saw 2 black students outperform their kids, and they wanted to make sure that those kids did not get the opportunity to shine, in addition to getting their kids up there. They saw the opportunity with their privilege, they saw the opportunity to push their kids ahead, and they took it. Which means that we also need to ask the reverse question. If this situation were in fact reversed, and you had 2 white kids win based off of the QPA average, and 2 black kids had said, no, we won the GPA, the opposite situation of what happened and transpired in this current situation, would the school have made the exception for the 2 black students? If the answer isn't obviously yes, which I don't think it is, then we need to have a long conversation about how this is really involved in racism and racist policies. In fact, what I would expect from a lot of white families would be, well, why should they get it? This is just affirmative action. This is just them being pushed ahead when they don't really deserve it. And the fact that I can hear all those arguments, the fact that it is something that isn't unimaginable to me as someone looking at this from the outside, that tells me that this actually is racially motivated in some way, and that the reverse case would not have gone in the favor of the black students. And this really hits on something, in the fact that this is also not a unique situation. The lawyer involved, Lisa Ross, has had other cases just like this one, where racial tensions have been involved. There's another article that came out in Mississippi Today. Court rules against former student in Cleveland School District discrimination claim over shared valedictorian title. And the fact that this lawyer has been dealing with these cases and talks about it through the lens that Mississippi is still a racialized place and has a lot of race issues means that this kind of thing is happening far more than is being talked about in the news. We have here that a white student whom another student, Shepard, shared the valedictorian role, also took a course that was erroneously awarded more points than what the curriculum grade allowed. And the white student was allowed to enroll in a non-approved online physics class. These 2 errors combined boosted her GPA to be as high as Shepard's, according to court filings. Shepard being put in a class she had already taken also lowered her GPA. And that's part of this bizarre thing with grades that I was talking about before. The student Shepherd actually removed herself from the humanity, anatomy, and physiology class because that class would actually lower her GPA even if she got an A in it. So she legit asked to be removed from a class as part of her education in order to secure a higher GPA because the class would actually lower it. And that to me is part of the problem with the current grading system and the way that grades are competitive. Just wanted to point that out. But Lisa Ross does say, who represented Shepherd, that she doesn't believe that Shepherd's case is one of random accidents, but were instead racially motivated. And the unfortunate reality is, for a lot of these cases, they are racially motivated. And another question we need to ask in all of this, given that this is a common incident that seems to be happening far more than we are talking about, given the fact that I don't really believe that if the girls had been the ones with the GPA as opposed to the QPA, that they would have been put into that position. And given the history that goes into all of this, what message is this sending these two young Black girls that they are going to constantly work hard and find themselves being met with white kids effectively given affirmative action just for their privilege of being white? There's an old saying, you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half as far, and this is proving that point. Now, while it was also claimed during this article that all of this had little to do with the family background, I think that there is actually a class problem going on here that isn't being addressed. White families, such as the one who was able to own a major part of the industry and business in Mississippi in this area, had a historic advantage over any Black families that are currently in that area, namely due to the economic situations that were presented through segregation and through Jim Crow policies and the separate but equal policies, never mind the ties that go all the way back to the history of slavery. This white family clearly had the ability to gain access to money, wealth, and resources, and were able to run a business for many generations that has had such an impact that their names are on high schools and buildings. And for this person to be able to get their name out there as valedictorian or salutatorian at the cost of the position for a Black girl says that they were able to throw that name around there. Even if the article says the name was never really brought up, there's every room for potential bias there. And the fact that we can conceive of that, whether it's true or not, I personally think it is, but whether it's true or not, the fact that we can conceive of that as a possibility tells us about this very racialized and class-based history that ties the socioeconomic factors of race and class together for these students. And despite all of that, these two young girls were able to reach a place where they fully earned, the positions of valedictorian and salutatorian. Their QPAs were higher. That is the better statistic to use over the GPA in these circumstances. Weighted averages tell us a lot more about what students had to go through during the process. And if we have to have grades and we have to have all this competition, that's the metric to use. And they deserve this exclusively. There's no reason that these white kids need to be propped up in order to satisfy the egos of the people involved. And it's an absolutely absurd and racist premise that we need to hand these white kids up to this position and that we need to deny these young Black girls who have earned this position where they've worked twice as hard and again have gotten half as far. So with that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.